Keanu Reeves stood amidst the whirlwind of movement at Los Angeles International Airport, his presence effortlessly blending into the crowd as conversations merged into an indistinguishable hum. Travelers rushed from one gate to another. Luggage wheels rolled across the polished floors, flight announcements crackled through the speakers, and the air carried a distinct scent of coffee, fast food, and jet fuel. Amidst the organized chaos, a man stood calmly in the first-class check-in line, exuding an air of tranquility that sharply contrasted the tension of those around him. He wasn't frantically checking his phone, nor did he appear impatient about the line ahead. He simply stood there, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn-out jeans, his posture relaxed. That man was Keanu Reeves. Dressed in a plain plaid shirt, faded jeans, and well-traveled boots, Keanu looked like any ordinary traveler. He carried a single backpack, one that had seen its fair share of adventures. There was nothing flashy about him, no designer suit, no extravagant luggage, no sunglasses to shield him from recognition. Despite this, his mere presence commanded attention, even if most people failed to recognize him at first glance. Not everyone failed to notice him, though. Victor Harding was standing just behind Keanu in the first-class line, and unlike the man in front of him, he exuded entitlement. He was dressed to impress, sporting an impeccable navy blue designer suit, perfectly polished shoes, and a watch that cost more than some people's entire yearly salary. His hair was neatly styled, and his cologne was strong enough to make an impression before he even spoke. Victor's entire demeanor screamed status, power, and self-importance. His gaze flickered toward Keanu, and immediately a frown crept onto his face. Something about the man in front of him didn't sit right. It wasn't just his casual attire. Victor had seen plenty of rich people dressed down, but there was something about Keanu's unbothered nature, his quiet confidence, that irritated him. He doesn't belong here. Victor adjusted his cufflinks, let out a quiet scoff, and finally decided to break the silence. "First class, huh?" he said, his voice laced with amusement. "You never know who might show up here these days." Keanu turned his head slightly, offering a small, polite smile, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he said, his voice calm. "The world is full of surprises." Victor blinked, momentarily thrown off by the response. He had expected embarrassment, defensiveness, something that confirmed his assumption that this man didn't belong in first class. Instead, Keanu's calm reaction made him feel off balance. So he pushed further. "Look, nothing personal," Victor said, forcing a chuckle. "But you don't really seem like the type to fly first class. It's rare to see someone so casual in a place like this." Keanu met his gaze, still unfazed. "I guess comfort looks different for everyone." Victor's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth to respond, but just then, the boarding call for first class was announced. The line began moving, and without another word, Keanu grabbed his ticket and proceeded forward, his pace unhurried, almost effortless. Victor followed, but as they stepped onto the plane, his irritation grew into full-fledged disbelief. Victor found his seat and checked his ticket twice just to be sure. Then he looked up. Keanu was settling into the seat right next to him. "You have got to be kidding me." Victor clenched his jaw, shaking his head slightly as he sat down. Of all the seats in first class, of all the people who could have been his neighbor, it had to be this guy. He let out a short chuckle, half amused, half frustrated. "Well, isn't this something?" he muttered under his breath. Keanu glanced at him and smiled again. "Looks like we're traveling together then." Victor crossed his arms, trying to hide his annoyance. It wasn't just the seating arrangement, it was the fact that this man he had so quickly judged was now sharing his exclusive space. The cabin crew prepared for takeoff, and soon enough, the plane was airborne. The hum of the engines filled the air, and first-class service began. As the flight attendant approached, Victor immediately made his presence known. "A glass of champagne, please," he said with a confident smile. "Something that fits the exclusivity of this cabin." The flight attendant, accustomed to such requests, nodded and moved on. When she reached Keanu, he simply said, "Just water, please." Victor's ears perked up at that. He turned his head slightly, a smirk playing on his lips. Water, he repeated, barely suppressing a laugh. Come on, man. You're in first class. You could have anything. Why waste the experience with water? Keanu took the bottle from the flight attendant, unscrewed the cap, and took a slow sip before replying. I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough. Victor narrowed his eyes. Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less. He took a sip of his champagne, then added, Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer. Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he set his bottle down on the tray and studied Victor carefully, as if observing something beneath the surface. Maybe the best is different for everyone, he finally said. Victor let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You really believe that? Keanu's gaze didn't waver. I do. The tension between them was almost palpable now, and the surrounding passengers were starting to take notice. A few exchanged quiet glances, sensing the undercurrent of unspoken conflict between the two men. Victor, however, wasn't done yet. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal. You know, he said, swirling the champagne in his glass, life is a lot like first class. You work hard, earn your spot, and get to enjoy it. But some people, well, they only end up here because they got lucky. For the first time, Keanu's expression shifted slightly. It wasn't anger, it was something quieter, deeper. He leaned back, exhaled slowly, and then said, Luck or hard work? We all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we? The words hit differently than anything Victor had expected. They weren't defensive, they weren't aggressive, yet they carried a weight that unsettled him. Passengers nearby began to pay closer attention. The subtle clash between the two men was growing too compelling to ignore. Victor let out another laugh, but this time there was a strain to it. He wasn't sure why, but Keanu's calmness made him uncomfortable. Why isn't he getting rattled? Why isn't he fighting back? Victor wasn't ready to back down, not yet, and so he pushed harder. You know what's funny? He said. People who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about things like humility and simplicity. Ever noticed that? Keanu turned fully toward him now, his expression unreadable. Then he said something that stopped Victor cold. I've noticed that the people who talk the most about what they have are often the ones who feel the emptiest inside. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. For the first time, Victor didn't have a comeback. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. And for the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Doubt. But what happened next would change everything. The silence in first class grew heavier, settling over the cabin like an unshakable presence. Even though the hum of the engines remained steady, the exchange between Keanu and Victor had cast a ripple through the air, shifting the atmosphere. People were paying attention now. Victor, who had been the center of his own world for so long, was no longer in control of the conversation. He had tried to assert dominance, to remind this unassuming man beside him of his perceived inferiority, but instead he found himself facing a mirror, and he didn't like what he saw. Across the aisle, an elderly man with graying hair and sharp eyes lowered his newspaper. He had been observing quietly, absorbing every word exchanged between the two men. He smiled to himself, as if amused, before turning back to his paper. Further back, a young woman in business attire subtly glanced over the top of her tablet, her fingers hovering over the screen, no longer scrolling. Even the flight attendants who moved through the aisles seemed to be casting careful glances in their direction, aware that something significant was unfolding. Victor felt it all, the weight of their attention, the way his own words had boomeranged back at him. He suddenly felt too warm in his expensive suit, the collar too tight, his glass of champagne too heavy in his grip. And yet his ego refused to let him stay silent. With a forced chuckle, Victor straightened his tie and turned back toward Keanu. I have to admit, he said, his tone shifting slightly, you're not what I expected. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He simply took another sip of water, composed as ever. Expectations can be limiting, Victor exhaled sharply. He wasn't used to people like Keanu, people who didn't play the game. For a moment, Victor considered letting the conversation drop, but something about Keanu's unshakable calm irritated him even more. He wanted to get a reaction. He wanted control back. So he leaned in slightly and said, "Tell you what, I run an investment firm. We deal with high-end clients, people with real money. If you're in film, you know how tough that business can be." He gave a knowing smirk. "Let's say I offer you an opportunity, a way to turn whatever small projects you're working on into something much bigger." Keanu studied him for a moment before speaking. "Are you offering me a job, Victor?" Victor's smirk widened. "Not a job, a chance. Connections like mine could open doors you wouldn't even dream of. And in return, you'd have the backing of someone who knows how to stay on top." There it was, Victor's lifeline. When power and arrogance failed him, he fell back on what he understood best: transactions. Keanu, however, wasn't buying. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering it, before responding. "Success isn't measured by who backs you, Victor. It's measured by what you stand for when no one else is looking." Victor stiffened. Why was it so impossible to shake this guy? A slight turbulence rocked the cabin, causing a few passengers to grip their armrests. The plane remained steady, but something about the sudden jolt made Victor feel uneasy. Or maybe, deep down, it wasn't the turbulence. Maybe it was something else. Something about Keanu's words brought back memories he had long buried. He saw his younger self sitting in a cheap rental car, staring at an eviction notice. He remembered the desperate decisions, the ruthless moves he had made to claw his way up. He had told himself that winning at any cost was the only option, that kindness was for the weak. And yet, here was Keanu Reeves, a man who clearly had everything Victor craved, acting like none of it mattered. Victor scoffed and leaned back in his seat. "You really believe all that? That success is about being a good person?" Keanu met his gaze without hesitation. "I believe success is about what you leave behind. It's about whether you made the world a little better than how you found it." Victor shook his head, laughing under his breath. "That's easy for you to say. You've already made it." Keanu's gaze turned thoughtful. "You think success changes who you are? No, it only reveals you. If you were cruel before, success makes you crueler. If you were kind before, success gives you the power to extend that kindness. Money doesn't change you, Victor. It just magnifies what's already there." Victor swallowed hard. He didn't want to admit it, but those words hit deeper than anything he had heard in years, and for the first time, Victor felt small. The flight continued, and Victor sat in silence, turning over Keanu's words in his mind. Then, something unexpected happened. A flight attendant rushed down the aisle toward an older woman in first class. She was clutching her chest, her face pale. A few passengers gasped, and panic rippled through the cabin. The woman's husband stood helplessly beside her, his hands shaking. She's having trouble breathing," he stammered. Victor froze. For a moment, he was paralyzed, watching the scene unfold. Then, Keanu was on his feet. Without hesitation, he moved toward the woman, speaking calmly to the flight attendants. "She needs space. Lower her head a little. Here, let me help." Passengers watched in shock as Keanu knelt beside her, his face full of concern, completely unbothered by who was watching. Victor felt something twist in his chest. Not just because of Keanu's actions, but because he had done nothing. All his power, his wealth, his status, and none of it mattered right now. And in that moment, he saw the difference between himself and Keanu. One of them was respected for his character. The other was feared for his status. And only one of those things really mattered. The woman stabilized after a few minutes, and the cabin slowly returned to normal. But Victor remained still, his thoughts racing. He thought about how he had spent his life pushing others down just to feel bigger, how he had used money and power as a shield to hide his own insecurities. And then he thought about Keanu, a man who had nothing to prove, and yet had still chosen to help a stranger without hesitation. Victor exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: shame. He turned toward Keanu, but the actor was already back in his seat, quietly reading a book, as if nothing had happened. Victor hesitated, then finally spoke. "I misjudged you." Keanu didn't look up. "Most people do." Victor nodded to himself. Maybe I misjudged a lot of things. Keanu glanced at him then, and for the first time, Victor saw something in his eyes that he couldn't quite describe. Not pity, not amusement, just understanding. And in that moment, Victor realized something profound. Success wasn't about who had the most money. It wasn't about power. It was about who you chose to be when no one was watching. And for the first time, Victor knew he had been chasing the wrong thing all along. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change. The flight moved through the sky, a silent witness to the change in the atmosphere within the first-class cabin. The confrontation that had unfolded earlier now hung in the air, unresolved yet undeniable. Passengers who had been discreetly watching the exchange between Keanu and Victor had returned to their own routines, but a few still cast occasional glances in their direction, curious if anything more would unfold. Victor, who had spent his life believing that power and wealth dictated respect, now sat uncharacteristically quiet. The tension in his shoulders had loosened, but his mind was a battlefield of self-reflection. It wasn't just Keanu's words that had unsettled him. It was the realization that, for all his success, something inside him still felt hollow. He had spent years building an empire, ensuring his name was synonymous with influence and status. He had secured every material comfort he could want. And yet, here he was, seated next to a man who had everything, yet acted as if he needed nothing. For the first time, Victor felt the weight of the life he had built pressing against him, and he wasn't sure he liked it. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, preparing for the final meal service. Victor, usually one to demand special treatment, barely registered the interaction. He caught glimpses of Keanu flipping through the pages of his book, completely unaffected by everything that had transpired. The simplicity of the gesture gnawed at him. How could someone be so at ease, so unbothered by status or perception? He glanced at the business card tucked into his wallet, the one he had nearly handed to Keanu earlier. He had been so sure that offering him a deal, a way into more wealth, would give him the upper hand. Now it felt like a meaningless piece of paper. The silence between them stretched until Victor finally spoke. "You're a hard person to figure out." Keanu looked up from his book, his expression neutral. "Most people don't try to figure me out, they assume." Victor exhaled through his nose, nodding. He had done exactly that. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled their attention. A man in his early 60s, distinguished yet humble in appearance, stopped beside their row. His hair was mostly gray, but his posture was strong. He gave a knowing smile before addressing Keanu. "I just wanted to say that I've followed your work for years, but more than that, I've always admired how you carry yourself." Keanu returned the smile, extending a hand. "Thank you, that means a lot." The older man shook it firmly, then turned slightly, his eyes landing on Victor. "You have a good seatmate here," he remarked. "More people should take the time to listen to men like him." Victor felt the full weight of those words as the man gave a polite nod and walked away. This was different from the usual praise Victor heard in his circles. The compliments he received were always transactional, a currency of favors and influence. This, however, was genuine respect, given freely, without expectation. Victor folded his hands together, watching as Keanu picked up his book again, as if nothing had happened. "I don't get it," he admitted, shaking his head. "You don't act like someone who has all of that." He gestured vaguely, encompassing everything Keanu was. His fame, his fortune, his influence. Keanu turned a page in his book before responding. "And how do you expect someone like me to act?" Victor hesitated. "I don't know, like you've made it, like you deserve the best of everything because you earned it." Keanu chuckled under his breath. "Do you think people deserve more than others based on how much they have?" Victor leaned back, his jaw tightening. He had spent his life operating under the belief that status meant superiority, that wealth wasn't just an advantage, it was a dividing line between those who mattered and those who didn't. But Keanu wasn't playing by those rules. "Let me ask you something, Victor," Keanu continued, setting his book down. "What happens when you take all of that away?" Victor frowned. "What do you mean?" Keanu gestured toward the cabin, toward the people, toward the world beyond the plane. "Strip away the suits, the money, the titles. Who are you without all of it?" Victor stared at him, unable to answer right away. Keanu leaned forward slightly. Most people never stop to ask themselves that question, because the answer scares them. A lump formed in Victor's throat. He had spent his entire life building his image, fortifying his reputation, ensuring that no one ever questioned his importance. But what if none of it really mattered? What if Keanu was right? The turbulence that followed was minor, a light shake through the aircraft, but it was enough to make Victor's heart race, because it reminded him how little control he really had. When the plane landed, when they walked through the terminal, when the world moved on, what would he be left with? As the final descent announcement came through the speakers, the cabin stirred to life. Passengers stretched, some gathering their belongings, others finishing conversations. Victor sat still. Keanu turned back to him one last time, his voice quieter now. It's never too late to decide who you want to be. Victor didn't know why, but those words stayed with him. The plane touched down smoothly, and passengers began to unbuckle their seatbelts. As Victor stood, he caught sight of Keanu taking his backpack, slinging it effortlessly over his shoulder. No expensive luggage, no grand display, just a man moving through the world without needing validation. They stepped off the plane together, but as they entered the terminal, they were met with a scene Victor hadn't expected. A small crowd had gathered, not an overwhelming one, just a handful of people who had recognized Keanu. Some asked for photos, others simply offered handshakes. Victor watched as Keanu stopped to greet every single one of them. Not out of obligation, not out of necessity, because he wanted to. There was no security detail shoving people aside, no air of superiority, just genuine human connection. And it hit Victor like a punch to the chest. This man had everything. He was known across the world, admired in ways most people could only dream of. And yet here he was, treating everyone around him like equals. Victor had spent his entire career trying to be feared and respected, but Keanu had done something even greater. He had earned love. Victor turned away before anyone could see the raw emotion creeping into his expression. He walked through the terminal, his thoughts heavier than his luggage. And for the first time in his life, he didn't care about being the most powerful man in the room. For the first time in his life, he questioned whether he had ever truly mattered at all. The world outside the airport was waiting. Victor didn't know what came next. But as Keanu's words echoed in his mind, it's never too late to decide who you want to be, he realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to start over. Victor stepped out into the terminal, the artificial glow of overhead lights casting elongated shadows across the polished floor. The sounds of the airport, rolling luggage, murmured conversations, and distant announcements felt muted compared to the weight in his chest. His steps slowed, his mind still processing the conversation that had unraveled thousands of feet above the ground. For years, he had conditioned himself to see the world in a particular way. Success meant power, power meant control, control meant respect. That was the formula. He had built his empire on it, honed his instincts around it, and carried himself like a man who had mastered the game. And yet Keanu Reeves had dismantled it all without lifting a finger. Victor had encountered powerful men before, CEOs, politicians, moguls, the kind of people who walked into a room and expected gravity itself to bend around them. Keanu wasn't one of them. He didn't demand attention, he didn't assert his presence. And somehow he commanded more respect than anyone Victor had ever met. Victor found himself standing near a cafe, his hands in his pockets, watching as Keanu moved through the airport with an ease that defied the usual frenzy of travel. He greeted a janitor with a nod, shared a warm laugh with a fan who had recognized him, and even stopped to help a woman struggling with her suitcase. Every action was effortless, every moment genuine. Victor had spent years chasing something Keanu seemed to possess naturally, but what was it? It wasn't just humility, it wasn't just kindness. It was something deeper. Victor's fingers brushed the edge of his wallet, the weight of his business card a reminder of who he had been just hours ago. A man who sized people up before he even knew their names. A man who measured worth in status rather than substance. A man who, until today, believed that everything and everyone had a place, and some places simply weren't meant for certain people. And now? Now, he wasn't sure where he stood. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his assistant. "Your driver is waiting outside. Shall I confirm your dinner with the investors?" Victor's stomach turned. Normally, he would have responded instantly, kept the schedule moving, ensured that the next deal, the next power play, the next carefully orchestrated meeting was locked in. But tonight, it didn't feel right. For the first time, Victor hesitated. His gaze drifted back to Keanu, who was now standing at a vending machine, pulling out a bottle of water. It was such an ordinary, insignificant act, yet Victor couldn't look away, because there was something about Keanu's presence that didn't belong to the world Victor had built for himself, and deep down, he envied that. Victor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He couldn't just undo the man he had spent decades becoming. Couldn't just wake up and decide that his entire foundation had been wrong. But maybe he could question it. Without really thinking, he turned and started walking, not toward his waiting car, not toward his next meeting, but toward Keanu. "Reeves?" he called out, voice steadier than he felt. Keanu turned, bottle of water in hand, eyebrows lifting slightly. Victor hesitated. He wasn't sure what he was about to say, only that he needed to say something. He exhaled, running a hand down his face. What was he even trying to do? Apologize, explain, ask for advice? Keanu waited, patient as ever. Finally, Victor just sighed. "You're different from what I expected." Keanu smiled slightly. "I get that a lot." Victor let out a small chuckle, but it faded quickly. He hesitated before asking, "You ever regret it?" Keanu tilted his head. "Regret what?" Victor gestured vaguely. "Not playing the game, not using your name to get ahead, not taking advantage of the power you have." Keanu studied him for a moment before answering, "Power isn't the goal. Peace is." The words hit harder than they should have. Victor frowned. "And you think they're separate?" Keanu took a sip of his water, his gaze never wavering. "A lot of people think power will give them peace, but all it really does is make them chase more power. It's never enough. There's always another deal, another status symbol, another battle to win, and the more you chase it, the further away peace gets." Victor crossed his arms. "And what about success?" Keanu smiled slightly. "Success is just a byproduct of doing what you love with the right intentions. People get it backwards." Victor scoffed lightly, rubbing the back of his neck. "You make it sound so simple." Keanu's expression softened. "It is. People just complicate it." Victor swallowed. Was that what he had been doing all this time, making things more complicated? Creating battles where there didn't need to be any? For years, he had told himself he was building an empire, when in reality, he had just been building walls. Walls between himself and his employees, walls between himself and his family, walls between himself and who he used to be. And now, standing here in an airport terminal, talking to a man he had spent the past several hours underestimating, Victor had never felt smaller. Keanu finished his water and tossed the empty bottle into a nearby recycling bin. "Take care of yourself, Victor." Victor blinked. "That's it?" Keanu smiled knowingly. "Only you can decide what happens next." Victor watched as Keanu slung his backpack over his shoulder and headed toward his gate. No entourage, no security detail, no rush. When you're rushed, there's no need to rush. No security detail. No rush. Just a man walking his own path, unaffected by the world's expectations. Victor stood there, unmoving. A moment later, his phone buzzed again. "Your driver says he can wait a little longer. Are you on your way?" Victor stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the keyboard, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. He looked down at the business card still clutched in his hand. The same card he had once believed carried so much weight. Then, with a deep breath, he tore it in half. Maybe it was time to start building something new. Not an empire, not a name, but a life worth living. Victor turned away from his waiting car and started walking. And for the first time, he didn't know where he was going. But maybe just maybe, that was the point. Victor walked through the terminal, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the hum of moving travelers. He didn't know where he was going. For the first time in his life, he didn't have a destination mapped out. For years, everything had been meticulously planned, every meeting, every interaction, every calculated move that would push him further up the ladder. But at this moment, there was no next step, no power move, no strategy. Just an unfamiliar silence in his mind, where once there had been nothing but noise. He found himself near a quiet seating area by the large floor-to-ceiling windows. Planes taxied in the distance, their lights blinking against the darkening sky. Victor sat down heavily, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. He barely recognized the man looking back. How long had it been since he sat still without thinking about his next deal, his next move, his next win? The world had always taught him that slowing down meant losing, that if he wasn't pushing forward, he was falling behind. But Keanu had shown him something different. What if the real win wasn't about pushing harder, but learning when to stop? A chime interrupted his thoughts. His phone, another text. "Let me know when you've arrived at the restaurant. Investors are waiting." Victor exhaled, gripping the device like it was a lifeline to his old self. He could still go, still walk out of this terminal, get into his car, and return to the life he knew. No one would know that, for a brief moment, he had considered something else. No one would know that, for the first time, he had doubted everything he had built. He glanced down at the torn business card in his hand, the symbol of everything he had once believed in. Then, before he could overthink it, he dropped the pieces into the trash can beside him. It was a small gesture, insignificant to anyone watching, but to Victor it was everything. His phone buzzed again, another reminder, another demand for his time, his presence, his carefully curated persona. He took one last look at the message, then did something he never thought he would. He turned his phone off. Not silent, not do not disturb, off. The screen went black, and with it, so did the constant pull of expectation. Victor sat back, looking out at the planes preparing for departure. For the first time in years, he wasn't in a rush to go anywhere. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally headed in the right direction. Like what you saw, there's another video on screen you'll love. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories.